Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast. Today, my guest is Melissa Kim Corter, who is a depth psychologist and international bestselling author. And our topic is shadow work. And I'm so passionate and so excited about this topic. And this was such a beautiful and powerful episode. Melissa has a master's degree in depth psychology and Jungian archetypal studies, and she is currently working on pursuing her Ph.D. So she knows so much about this topic. But we really dive into what shadow work is, how to look at it. It doesn't have to be something deep and dark and scary. It can be absolutely beautiful and transformative. I personally believe that the deeper we dive into the shadow and the more we walk into the spaces of uncomfortableness, that is where our greatest growth and potential lie. And so I'm so excited to bring this episode to you. I want to thank you so much for listening. If you find value, please give us a like, a share, and a subscribe. And even more kudos, if you can leave us a review or a comment, we would be so grateful. And I want to thank you so much for being here today. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast, a place to explore possibility through mindfulness, movement, and self-discovery. Our intention is to deliver insight and inspiration while fostering conversations that are genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. We hope you will enjoy today's episode. Hi, Melissa. Good morning, and welcome to the Connected Community Podcast.
Hi, Nikki. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
I'm excited to have you. I have been wanting to have somebody talk about shadow work for a really long time, and I haven't quite found the right person, and I definitely think you're the right person. So I'm so happy to have you. So I want to just dive into your credentials because I think you have a lot going on. You have a master's degree in depth psychology and Jungian archetypal studies, and you're working on a PhD. You are an international bestselling author. You've written books, you've written articles, you have your own podcast. And so I love this. I love your background. And so can you break down what is depth psychology? Let's just go with that one first for people that are unfamiliar.
Sure. I love this question. It's fairly easy, actually. So there's a lot of different types of psychology, as we know. And what makes depth psychology a little bit different is they believe in this terrain of the mind that we call the unconscious. So there's other types of psychology that believe in the hidden part of self. And depth psychology really weaves in this hidden part, the part of us that's beneath the surface of our awareness. And it values that part of us, believing it contains information, symbolic forms, different impulses, complexes, and things that arise through our feelings and our sensations, although we're not able to point at them directly and say, I see this thing within me, but we can feel it, we can sense it, and tune into it.
Okay. And then how is that different from Jungian archetypal studies?
So actually they're very much related. So depth psychology is parallel to Jungian archetypal studies. The only difference is the Jungian perspective tends to include archetypes, which are part of the deeper part of the unconscious. It's a belief that there are these processes at play, that we have these ego defenses and different types of mechanisms that automatically are responding to our thoughts, our feelings, and our beliefs. And the Jungian perspective tends to believe in this concept called the shadow self. So that's one of the things that makes it a little bit different, but it's also what unifies depth psychology with Jungian psychology, helping to give a bit more context to the hidden part of us. It defines it a little bit more. And then there's certain principles that are believed in Jungian psychology that talk about what is the nature of the unconscious, what's in there, how does it operate, how do we get in touch with it. So it gives it a little bit more form versus depth psychology strictly doesn't always have to come with that Jungian influence, but it is still deeply connected to it.
Okay, so somebody could be a depth psychologist and have no background in Jungian philosophy.
It's difficult to answer because they likely have. They just may not know the source of that influence. Like a lot of times when people even talk about the unconscious or the shadow, they may
Yeah.
not necessarily relate that to Jungian psychology, even though Carl Jung was the one that coined the term the shadow self. Or so there's sort of overlap in these layers,
Yeah.
but most of it really is rooted in the Jungian perspective. But sometimes we haven't traced all of that back or studied the specific origins. That's where it
Yeah.
might be a little bit hazy or unclear how much of that Jungian influence has played a role in the depth psychology.
Okay. Yes, and you answered one of the questions I had, which was, is shadow work from Jung? And so you're saying he coined that term.
Yeah,
And so what's interesting about that is that Carl Jung has been around for a really long time. His teachings, I mean, obviously he's passed, but his teachings, and yet this whole idea of shadow work seems like it's just surged recently. And
yeah.
so, why is that?
I think it's just like anything else, right? There's trends over time. Now, if I were to answer that through the lens of depth psychology, I might say that we're experiencing the energy of the time. There's a
Yeah,
belief that every culture, every part of society is sort of operating with this collective energy. And we might say that that is influencing some of the things that are moving into our conscious awareness. I also think that we have more people that are opening up to this idea that there's more to us than what we can see, what we can sense, what we can know. I think there's more curiosity around that. And I think that shadow work has kind of become just one of those terms that all of a sudden is like trending again, because it's also made this resurgence through yoga communities and yoga teaching and all different scientific, spiritual, and like creative disciplines are kind of like dipping their toe into that realm of things with shadow work. So I think that's one of the reasons we kind of see this resurgence of it throughout time.
yeah, yeah. And I am a firm believer in shadow work and the power of it and how it's where our biggest growth comes from. So, for somebody that's never heard the word or the concept shadow work, what is shadow work? What does that mean?
One of the easiest ways to think about it, and I'll just say I try to stay really close to the roots of the Jungian perspective, simply because it makes it a little bit more clear. A lot of different shadow work that's out there. It's not necessarily that it's good or bad or better, but when we stay closer to sort of the origins, it kind of helps organize the information differently to understand where it came from and why. But essentially, shadow work is where we take anything that's hidden from our awareness and we bring it to consciousness. There's different ways of going about that. There's different philosophies on what that means. It can be something as simple as working on a problem, going within ourselves, feeling into it, thinking about it, imagining, daydreaming, and then from that place wanting to bring something forward, a solution, right? Or it can go deeper where we might be working on something that's more intense, a traumatic moment, an impactful event, something that's altered us on some level in our life experience. And often with trauma or those type of impactful moments, we sense there's something there, but we might not always know how it's affecting us, how it's holding us back. I think of it as freeing up energy that's sort of been bound within the traumatic moment or experience. And we can do that creatively. So that's one of the differences with working with shadow with someone that has been trained in the different ways that the shadow behaves is we know how to approach it so that the person doesn't have to feel re-traumatized or re-experience really difficult things.
Mhm.
And the shadow's not all bad. So that's the other difference in traditional shadow work is there's an idea that if you're out and about and you're just kind of like encountering it for the first time, there's an emphasis on the intensity. Usually, when it comes to shadow work, most people say it's
Mhm.
taking all these horrible things and making them into beautiful experiences, or accepting the parts of us that we tend to reject or suppress. And although that's true, and that is a big part of shadow work, It's also about discovering things within yourself that have not yet made their way into consciousness.
Hmm.
So think about an unmanifested talent, skill, or gift or quality that you really want to develop within yourself. Technically, that's kind of in shadow too. It hasn't been realized or actualized by the conscious mind yet. It hasn't been integrated necessarily. And that's a beautiful thing. So
Yeah.
shadow work can be very mysterious. And like you said, it can really, and it really helps us to grow emotionally, psychologically, and discover new things about ourselves as we become
Yeah.
more and more comfortable exploring that side.
I love that twist on it, that it doesn't have to be something dark and scary that we avoid, that we don't want to look at. It could be something that's hidden that can help us reach our full potential.
Yeah,
And maybe it is like you're creative and you've shoved it down because it wasn't valued in your family. And then you discover that you're creative and that's a shadow. And then you embrace it and it can become one of your biggest assets.
I love that. That's an excellent example. Absolutely. It's exactly that.
Yeah.
Discovering,
Yeah.
assimilating, integrating, and then seeing how this manifests, how we want to carry this gift forward into our lives. And ultimately it
Yeah.
helps others too, which is wonderful. We have a ripple. When we do shadow work, there's always a ripple that it has for the people in our lives and the people that we can affect as we show up in the world.
So do you want to share a little bit more about that ripple that you're talking about?
Yeah, I can actually use myself as a personal experience of this. I used to really hide a lot of different parts of my personality. To do this kind of work, even being here with you, is a result of working on my shadow. I had
Hmm.
a fear of public speaking. I was terrified. I wanted nothing to do with cameras or being in the spotlight. In fact, I was a photographer for a really long time because I wanted to hide.
Hmm.
And yet, when I started to focus on the feelings I had, the sensations I had around the discomfort of being in the spotlight, I was able to heal different limiting beliefs. I was able to forgive some different people in my life experience that had influenced me in not so great ways. I was able to really process different traumatic events. And the camera, like holding the camera as a photographer, became so much more than just capturing the essence of people. It was a barrier that kept me from showing up. So
Yeah.
when I discovered all of this, I just consciously chose to work with it. I was like, I want to understand why I'm operating in this way. It's kind of like, so in shadow work, we say there's not necessarily an issue unless you have an emotional charge. I had the emotional charge as a photographer. There was always this feeling of, I know I'm really good at this, but I don't feel
Yeah.
like I'm meant to do this. So we can
Yeah.
follow that emotional charge, which
Hmm.
ultimately is usually a form of communication from the depths of our shadow, our psyche, that's saying, hey, there's something here for you to look at and learn from.
Yeah. It's interesting because I had something similar happen to me really recently where I tend to trigger people. Like the bigger I get, sometimes I'll end up triggering people. And on the flip side, I see people's shadow really clearly. I see their light so clearly, and I see people's shadows really clearly. And I did a Akashic record reading, which was something that I didn't even feel strongly about. It's been transformational. And she twisted that and she's like, that's your gift. That's your greatest gift. Use that. And I have a master's in social work. I'm going to go back and do therapy. And she's like, this is what you need to do with people. You need to do shadow work. You need to trigger people. And she just flipped this concept of something that I was really rejecting and didn't like about myself and was pushing away and really kind of hated
Yeah.
to she flipped it and I'm like, oh my God, you're right. Like I'm pushing this away and it's my greatest gift. And so yeah, so I've had that experience and it was super transformational. And it
Great.
was just a perspective shift.
Isn't that amazing? Did you have
Yeah.
that feeling too of like almost like a reinvigoration? Like it's almost like there's this intense sort of burst of energy, this anticipation, this excitement. Like once you had that flip, it's like
Yes.
sort of energizes you. Isn't that
Yes. I'm like, oh my God, I could totally do this. And then when I started speaking it and sharing it, everybody in my community is like, oh my God, you absolutely have to do that. Yes. Like it just, 100% made sense. And so, and that's what makes me curious about the shadow piece too for other people is sometimes in my own shadow work, I've realized that there's shadows that come up I look at. And of course, not of course, but most of the time I have not enjoyed looking at the shadow. And then there's some shadows like that one that I just spoke of where I was able to embrace it and see the value in it. And then there's other ones that were not serving me that I've looked at and thought I need to change. And so when a shadow comes up for somebody, how do they know if it's something that they need to embrace and love about themselves or if it's something that genuinely needs to shift?
I love this question so much and what you're sharing. I'm just nodding in resonance because everything you're sharing is just so incredible and it speaks to this. So, the beautiful thing about that is if you are having something rise up, right, a discomfort, a feeling, a sensation, and you're not quite sure, the beauty in that is you don't need to know because the thing that happens within us, this is where it goes into a little bit more of the what I would call the anatomy of the shadow. So there's this idea in depth psychology and Jungian psychology that the psyche itself is self-regulating. So kind of like the nervous system is self-regulating, right? When the right conditions, when we are aware of our nutrition, our thoughts, our environment, all these different things, and we can find the state of balance and trust that the body's kind of trying to get us back there, the mind does the same thing. So, because the psyche is operating on our behalf and it has its own process of unfolding, when something rises up and when we have that awareness, that's basically the ego, which is the gatekeeper in our in this framework of the psyche. We have a gatekeeper called the ego. The ego gets such a bad reputation, but actually, what it's doing is it's between consciousness, what we see, what we know, what we can understand, and unconscious, but not in a negative way, just beneath the surface of awareness. The ego is the key to what moves through, what we allow, what we understand. And so when something is coming up for us, that's actually really wonderful, even if it feels terrible, because what
Mm,
that means is your ego is receiving. It's learning to expand. It's learning to have this strength, this ability to
mm,
hold more information. And then if we lean on
yes.
this idea that the psyche is self-regulating, you'll know. You'll know exactly what to do because you'll be prompted in different ways. If you listen to your intuition, you'll know, is this something I need to continue to follow? Because sometimes, honestly, as things move from the shadow into conscious awareness, they might just be leaving our experience. So
Mm,
sometimes we don't even have to necessarily always dig in deeper, do something with it. It might just feel like a fleeting thought, like, oh, this thing that felt so important, all of a sudden it's like, it's just gone. And then
yeah.
other moments it's like, oh, there's still a charge there. I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to keep working with this because it doesn't feel undone. So your intuition is really a great way to kind of gauge that
Hmm.
because there isn't a singular answer, right? We're so different and unique that what is affecting one of us, driving another one of us,
Yeah.
healing another one of us, it all looks so different. But if you trust your intuition, as you get more comfortable and familiar with the work, you'll know there will just be an instinctive
Yeah.
response. You'll even maybe feel a prompt of, I feel like I need to journal about this. I think I might need to go for a walk in nature. I think I
Yeah.
need to pick up the phone and have that difficult conversation or soak in the tub. But you'll have it within you. If you give yourself permission to just slow down, to tune in and listen, there will be something there. And if you get nothing at all, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
It might just indicate you need a little more time, a little more space. Just kind of put it on the side and see what emerges as you let it rest. I say it's kind of like a
Yeah.
cauldron, right? The psyche is like a cauldron. It's got all these amazing things that are percolating and swirling about and coming into form. Sometimes it just needs to sit and simmer a little bit
Yeah.
before we know what to do with that material.
And so what I'm hearing in between the lines too is that once it surfaces and it pops up for us to look at and it comes into our awareness, then that's amazing because it's no longer in our unconscious, it's in our
Right.
conscious, and then we can sit and simmer with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the ways it might do that is when we're not awake and alert, like going through our day to day life. A lot of us are busy, we're distracted, or we're super focused on different things. We might miss some of those details, which is why some of that shadow material, when it rises up, might come through a dream, sometimes as a nightmare, sometimes as an intense feeling or sensation. So
Yeah.
the shadow isn't trying to punish us. It's actually more of a field that's a container. So the shadow in itself isn't negative or bad. It's a containing element beneath our conscious awareness, which is also why we can never integrate all of it, right? It's kind of like we'll never discover
Yeah.
how amazing we really are because we're a
Yeah.
work in progress. But so when I hear people say things like, "Oh, we're going to integrate the shadow," I'm like, hmm. We can integrate
Yeah.
parts of it and shadow material, but ultimately it's this containing force beneath the surface that's
Yeah.
holding these things for us. So yeah.
Well, and so that brings me to another thought is that sometimes we'll have this experience where people are constantly giving us feedback and it's positive. And
Mhm.
so, and then it doesn't resonate with us, but we keep hearing it. So we know it's true from other people's perspective and it doesn't resonate with us. And so, how do we integrate something like that?
I love this. So if let me know if I'm tracking correctly. Would that be like, is it resonate to hear the word like blind spot? If I were to say, oh, we have our blind spots and other people can kind of see them in us, like that kind of a situation?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you I almost am resistant to share this, but I'll do it anyway. um, I have a women's group in a community that I'm part of, and they're always saying to me like I'm a leader, I'm a role model, and I hear it over and over again from so many different angles, and yet I'm not able to see it myself. And so I realize that it's something that everyone else is holding for me, but I've yet to be able to integrate it, and I'm confused at why that is.
Oh my gosh, I love this. So first of all, thank you for sharing that because with the hesitancy and stuff, it's really courageous to be able to just bring things, to the forefront. There's a couple things of possibility around that, and of course, maybe even something else that I'm not even going to share because it's just so vast in what we can experience. But sometimes that is the situation, right? Very straightforward. People recognize these qualities within me. They seem to see them so clearly, but yet here I am, either not embodying it, not feeling like I'm integrating that or showing up in that same way, but they see it in us. Sometimes it can be a projection. It can be a projection of what other people see. And that's all projections aren't negative. So just like the shadow, some
Yeah.
projections are really healthy and wonderful. We start to receive people's projections like, wow, they hold me to the certain standard or they see me in the certain light. So absolutely that can be part of it is they're projecting that onto you and you're just doing what you naturally do. So it may not feel to you like it's a leadership thing when maybe it is, but you might just be leading in a way that feels so authentic to you that you don't consider it leadership. So it's another
Mm,
thing.
yeah.
But the thing so my intuition always like gets going in these types of dialogues. The other thing I would wonder, and let me know if this resonates, and if not, that's okay. I would also wonder if there isn't something around leadership, leading, or those types of roles that creates a little bit of that need. So you know how you gave the example earlier of like when you flipped the script, it changed everything
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
I wonder if there isn't a similar like thread with this topic for you
Yes.
where it's like, well, what if we
Yes.
just flipped leadership to I'm really great at being present, holding space for people, right? Like I wonder if you just wouldn't weave in
Yes.
some other qualities and just be like, oh, I totally am a leader.
Yeah,
Maybe
I think I
things that,
associate like leadership with like ego
yeah,
like being egotistical. And so
yes.
there's this aversion to the label.
Yes, that's it. Oh my gosh. See, I love this because now it's like, oh, okay, here we are. This is shadow work. This is I'm
Here it
acknowledging,
is.
right? Like an association,
Yeah.
not necessarily good or bad. I mean, yeah, if it feels egoic or if it has that tone to it, then that might feel like a negative association.
Yeah.
But I love this for you because it's like, okay, I wonder what would happen if I embrace the qualities of leadership that feel really good and strong for me.
Yeah.
And I make peace with the fact that there's parts of that that I may not resonate with. And that can even be about, am I willing to disappoint others if they have an expectation of me? Because
Mm-hmm.
my leadership gets to look like this and not this. So there
Yeah.
might be a little something there too. And being really not
Yeah.
committed, because you're definitely committed. It's more like being more comfortable seeing yourself in that position. So I would work on all of the things in shadow
Mm-hmm.
around leadership, what it means. If I were working with you as a client, just having fun with this,
Yeah.
I would probably say, hey, maybe think of some of the top leaders that you absolutely loathe and you have no respect.
Yes.
They're really icky and
Yeah.
weird, and just kind of write about some of that. And then who are some of the leaders that you really respect and resonate with and you find value in their work or how they present, and look at that too, because all of those qualities will somehow be in shadow and they might be just informing your ideas around it.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a perfect example of some kind of shadow stopping somebody from reaching their full potential.
Yes, absolutely. And we just never know. We just never know what that is. I've had something that was so small and it really seemed insignificant. And it's like a thread. You ever like tug on a thread and it's like, oh my gosh, it just
Yes.
unravels all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes shadow work can be like that, where you just find yourself going, oh my gosh, how did I get into this territory? There's all of these things here. Um, but the thread, what I like about that metaphor is that's an example of how the psyche is trying to self-regulate. And as it's coming into balance, it might sometimes bring a little bit of something out of shadow for us to see, so we can tug on that thread and go, I wonder where this goes. I wonder what else is here.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious if you're familiar with human design.
A little bit. Yes. A
Okay,
little bit.
because this when you're talking about the projected stuff, it just lit up all my like all these ideas because in human design, there's projectors, there's projected channels, there's things that in somebody's chart that are projected upon them. And so that brings me to that interesting concept of if you're whatever it is, the person and people are projecting something on you, how do you work with that?
You work really hard to not let it be real, to remember that it's a filter, because even if it's positive,
Yeah.
it's still a projection. And part of the work that a lot of us are doing are learning how to pull back our projections from people, and that can be difficult and painful, and it can be beautiful and amazing. And so for an example of that is someone who's in a relationship, let's say, and maybe they have projected a lot of different qualities onto this individual. Maybe they see them in a certain light, we would say. And all of a sudden, for whatever reason, let's say one day they just look at that person and they're like, what was I thinking? This person is nothing like I thought. All these,
Yep.
and it's almost like they dissolve. It's like the
Hmm.
projections dissolve when you see something so clearly. Now, I've also had this in a beautiful way, though. I actually had recently had this experience. I was holding on to a lot of anger, like a lifelong journey of holding resentment toward someone who I believed had caused a lot of harm in my family lineage, we'll say. And people suffered so much from the choices, the behaviors, and things like that. And so I did a lot of work on myself to kind of unwind that. And even though it helped me grow and expand, it really informed a lot of my career path, because I studied the dark side of the personality as well because of the influences I've had. And what's shocked me, though, is the level of compassion I started to have that I thought was impossible. I would have never thought it would have been possible for me to have compassion for this type of person,
Hmm.
considering the types of things they had done.
Yeah.
And what it took, though, so again, if that ego is like the gatekeeper and it's letting more information through, I had a random conversation with a different family member who was outside of a lot of the drama, circumstances, situations. Their insight, they knew this person. They knew their childhood. They knew some of their struggles. And when
Yeah.
they just shared a couple pieces of insight, all of a sudden I didn't do this consciously. My heart just, I felt a shift in my heart. I
Mm.
got weepy and emotional. And it's like all of a sudden, my anger and my feeling, a lot of it just dissolved right there
Hmm.
on the spot. I wasn't trying to do that. I wasn't working consciously with my shadow to like, journal this stuff out. It just happened. So sometimes in life, we will receive something we didn't know we needed. And that's
Yeah.
part of shadow work too. It'll come in, it'll be a synchronistic moment. It will be a dream. It'll be someone that just drops some wisdom, channels some type of information, and you're just altered. Something shifts within you, but those projections all of a sudden can dissolve.
Hmm.
And with discernment, right? This individual still did those terrible things, caused a
Yeah.
lot of harm. That's context that I keep in mind. But my discernment now is different. I'm able to observe. I'm not trying to spiritualize it and assign meaning and say, oh, there's this higher purpose being served, because sometimes that keeps us a little bit distant from the very
Yeah.
humanness of our reactions. But instead, I can have both. And when we allow both in our experience, we're really strengthening the ego. Because at first, the ego doesn't know how to cope with certain things. It needs people, situations, circumstances to be put in a box. This is good.
Hmm.
This is bad. Growth is, wait a minute here. There's some of this here and some of this. It's not
Yeah.
all this or that. But when we do shadow work, we start to realize things are really multidimensional, multifaceted. People are
Yeah.
complicated, wonderful, and capable of terrible things. And if we trust ourselves, there's an unfolding happening that can show us what to do, how to go about it, and what the next step might be.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm reading this book, Soulcraft, right now. Have you heard of this book?
No, but I love that title, Soul Craft.
It talks about how there's the ego in the middle, and then spirit is above and soul is below. And how I have an experience of this past year, I've just been diving into soul, like soul work, which is shadow, which is feminine, which is nature, which is um that piece of it, right? And then spirit is masculine and connection with source and things like that. And what it's saying is that we need a healthy balance of both. And so there's sometimes where people are just diving into shadow, diving into shadow, diving into shadow, but they're not reaching for the spirit. And so there's no balance. I also have a friend who's is just connected with spirit. And everything is rainbows and sunshine and unicorns. And she's just now starting to scratch the surface on the soul. And so that book shares about how both need to be in balance for someone to be basically whole and complete.
Mhm.
Um, and you can't go into soul work, which is shadow work, until you have a healthy ego, right? And so I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Oh, it's so fascinating. There's so many layers I really resonate with. Um, yeah, it'd be so interesting to see like what the background of the person is, because I think that gives
Mm,
context on, is this personal experience that the spirit is here and the soul is here. So it'd be really interesting to see how that came about for them. I resonate with that.
mhm,
I think that's interesting. I haven't experienced it in that same way, but I really do like feel that there's a lot of truth in those different pieces and how these things manifest for us. And I think that's what's great about all of this kind of work is there's so many doorways in. And some doorways are like, nope, not for us. And others are like, yeah, I need to go in there.
mhm.
So I think that's the great thing about all of this stuff is you really just trust yourself and see what you're led to, what materials, what teachers, what speakers. And sometimes I like to take little bits and pieces and go, yeah, there's something there for me in that. And again, I think it also depends on what is informing the perspective. But I agree with the balance too. I do think there's season of our lives where we're going really deep into things. There's other seasons of our lives that might be more joyful, playful, um, less digging and unearthing things and
Yeah.
healing. I think it's important. I think it's important. I do feel like there's parts of us that naturally know how to unfold according to those seasons. If we trust the soul, we'll know what season we're in. We'll experience the qualities, the things of that season. And then there'll be another season that follows, which I think is
Yeah.
helpful. I work a lot with the dark night of the soul and those kind of things with people. I just
Yeah.
remind them it's temporary. It's temporary, all of it's
Yeah.
temporary. And go deep, let it consume you a little bit. I know
Mm.
it's not typical for people to say, but when we sort of give ourselves permission to surrender in that way, we're actually teaching the ego how to receive. And that's powerful. So surrender is the way the
Mhm.
ego learns how to let more in, you know.
Yeah. How do you guide people to surrender? Because I think in our culture and our society, we're so skilled at avoidance and distraction and keeping ourselves busy and not taking moments by ourselves and for self reflection and self discovery. And so it can be really overwhelming and big and scary for people to even touch on those shadow pieces. So, how do we encourage that in a nurturing way that's not so scary, where you just kind of take the baby steps into the pool instead of diving right into the middle?
I love this. Great question. Great question. So, one of the things that's really important to me in my work is that we invite in creativity, because creativity is a wonderful way for us to work with shadow material, to transmute it, transform it in a way that isn't, it can still be activating, but it doesn't have to be crippling, or it doesn't have to be so overwhelming that it causes a host of other issues. So creativity is one of the things I do with that. And what I'll often have people do, and the beauty in this is it doesn't even matter where they are. They can be in the depths of something really challenging, or they could be kind of wanting to dip their toe in. And I work with fairy tales. I actually will work
Mm,
with different fairy tales. But the one thing that makes fairy tales activate things within us is if we actually go to the fairy tales that are like the old school grim tales.
yeah,
So
yeah, and
no
most of them
watered
are.
down. What's that?
Most of them are.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
have
They're
like a dark
intense.
element to them.
That's right. And there's still there's so much beauty and wisdom in them. And
Mhm.
the point of the working with a fairy tale is that we have all these different psychological processes that are happening instinctively within us. There's also this sort of structuring that's happening as we go through life. It's not a fixed situation where, you know, at this point in your life you have this happen and then this happens. It doesn't play out necessarily like a movie, which would make things so much easier. But for some of us, we have these different points along the life journey that are meaningful, that are impactful. So what happens is if we read, we just intuitively choose a fairy tale. You don't have to know
Mhm.
anything about it. You might already have one that's a favorite, and you might just want to explore. I wonder why I'm always drawn to this fairy tale. There's usually
Mhm.
something there. Or you can just do a random Google search and just type in Grimm's Tales and look at a couple different sources. The other thing that's beautiful about fairy tales is there's often many different types of retellings of the same story. So you might find five different
Yeah.
versions of Cinderella or something like that. And what you do is you go into it with a beginner's mind. Even if you know the story, you may not know what the story is activating for you at this season of your life, or you
Mhm.
may not know what it's really your psyche is trying to tell you. And it will start communicating with you through the symbolic language of the fairy tale. So you read the tale first. And what I suggest to clients, if they're just kind of starting out with this type of experience, is you just take notes as you're reading the fairy tales. Just, oh, this stood out to me. I noticed this detail, right? You're not really trying to investigate anything just yet. You're just taking in the fairy tale to see what's going on.
Yeah.
You also want to pay attention to thoughts, memories, and what I call a somatic response, right? Like a body based reaction or response to the material. Because sometimes that's guidance also hidden in like this
Yeah.
random or seemingly random charge, energetic charge. So you read the tale, you take some notes, what you're noticing, what you're feeling. Then you look at the elements. What is happening to the main character? What ordeals are they going through? There's usually core wounds associated with our ordeals. There's
Yeah.
5 core wounds that I teach my clients and students. You look for rejection, you look for abandonment, you look
Mhm.
for betrayal, you look for humiliation, and you look
Mhm.
for violation.
Yeah.
When we look into the fairy tale,
Mhm.
it gives us a little bit of psychological distancing from our personal traumas, tragedies, life experiences. When we're focused on the character in the tale, we will
Yeah.
start to see ourselves. We'll start to see elements that start rising up and going, oh, that's really eerie and uncanny how that happened. I relate to that. And what that does is we see something in something else outside of ourselves, And it helps us make connections that the ego was initially blocking us from
Mm,
because it wants to keep us safe. But if we see it
yeah.
creatively through someone else's story, and we do this all the time when we talk to each
Yeah.
other, we tell our stories, experiences, we resonate with things. We do the same thing in a fairy tale. The
Yeah.
fairy tale isn't discerning, though. It's not going to eliminate the difficulties, the realities of humanity. All of it's embedded in there. So we're going to come across the big bad
Yeah.
wolf. We're going to learn how to develop our intuition. We're going to be betrayed. We're going to, have these creatures, people, scenarios that cross our path. We're also going to discover all the helpers along the way, that we're not alone, that protagonist in that journey is in their own individuation process, which means their psyche is sort of showing us symbolically through this journey all the things that needed to happen for them to come back to their idea of wholeness. So
Hmm.
that's the whole thing that happens when we read a fairy tale, when we
Yeah.
listen and pay attention closely and tune in and just see what stirs us and do some free writing on it. And it can
Yeah.
really be quite illuminating.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, it makes
Yes.
me also think of the parallel of how we can see other people's things so much more clearly than our own.
Yeah.
For me, if people come to me for advice, I can give them amazing advice, but when it comes to my own life, I just can't see it.
Yes.
And sometimes I'll think about, we'll do a healing circle with some friends or something, and I'll be giving advice. And then later I think, oh my God, I need to like take all my own advice.
Right.
And so it's maybe like what we're sharing for, other people, coping skills and tips and techniques and things. If we could flip it around and look at how that can impact us too.
Yes. In fact, what you're speaking to is a big part of something called Jungian analysis.
Hmm.
So, when people work with a Jungian analyst, which is just a particular branch of therapy, what
Yeah.
that's actually a big part of it. So, the therapist themselves or the analyst themselves is analyzing their feelings, their
Hmm.
thoughts, their sensations at the same time that the client is sitting with them, and it's brought together in this way so that the client doesn't feel like the therapist is on a pedestal, or because we know when we do this work there's natural power dynamics that play
Yeah.
there. But
Hmm.
in analysis, it's so great because the analyst has to really pay attention to what they're saying, what they're suggesting, how they're doing it, and they are very clear that the client sitting across from them is often reflecting some of their shadow material. And it's
Yeah.
this really beautiful integrative thing. So they work with it. It's called counter transference, when the analyst is feeling, sensing, and bringing that forward and seeing if that resonates with the
Yeah.
client, how it fits. And then in between sessions, because analysts usually will work with a client for years, it can be decades. Like, it's an
Yeah.
ongoing, deep relationship. And often the analyst will come back and say, I had this dream. How does this reflect for you? Because often they know that what they're doing, living, and experience is it's a shared
Yeah.
experience in this field that's created between two people. So I love
Oh,
how you
that's
just shared that. I'm like,
interesting.
yes, that's
Yeah.
so good.
I mean, it's also as when somebody triggers us, we all have that person that just triggers us, that drives us crazy, and we don't know what it is, but we just can't stand them, and we don't might not even know them well.
Yeah.
Um, and and then there's something in there for us to look at,
Oh yeah,
because if we were neutral, then it wouldn't be a big deal, right? But if we're
absolutely.
triggered, um, then it's probably something that we're seeing in them that unconsciously we're not accepting and liking about ourselves.
Absolutely. I actually have a really great example of how that happened to me. Uh, and I love this because it wasn't so clear cut. Some of these things, we use a lot of terminology across all these different fields and disciplines where we'll say, like, oh, there's a mirroring thing happening, or,
Hmm.
this person's reflecting this part of me. But what I love is how creative this can be. It doesn't have to be a direct, like, they're doing this, therefore I must have this in me in that way. So, for example, what was going on with me is I was experiencing some bullying, and it
Hmm.
was really annoying. And as an adult, I wasn't even a kid, so it was like more annoying. I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
an adult. Like, I thought we grew out of this stuff.
Yep.
And I was being bullied by these two women, and they were kind of in the industry I was in at the time. And anyway, there was some history there, but the bullying kept happening. It started with one, and then it was another one, and I was like, okay, there's a pattern. So anytime there's a pattern and an
Yeah.
energetic charge, there's something to look at. And I kept doing all of the things I thought I should do. Well, I don't feel like I'm a bully. I don't feel like I'm bullying people. That's where I was going with it. I'm like, if this is happening to me, I must be doing this in some way. I was really fixated on that detail.
Yeah.
I started working with this one mentor. Actually, at the time, I had been working with her for quite some time. And I brought this up in a conversation. I was like, I'm so fed up with this pattern. Can we just dive into this? Like, am I a bully? Am I doing this? Is it in my shadow? Do I not see it? Is
Yeah.
this my blind spot? And she's like, how do you talk to yourself? And I was like,
Oh, yeah. You're like, oh, I don't want to look at
talk
this.
about like the air, right? Coming out of a balloon. I just felt like,
Yeah.
oh, my whole being deflated. And I went,
Mhm.
yeah, you got me. You got me. And it really, I have chills even talking about it now. It wasn't that I was bullying other people, but I was a bully to myself.
Yeah.
They were outside of me, right? They're doing their thing. I was
Mm.
responding to it and I was shutting down. And what also was what this was teaching me is I was someone who had to make myself the problem. So if something was out of balance, if someone wasn't kind, if something was happening, I somehow needed to take personal responsibility. This is the shadow side of shadow work is we'll
Mhm.
sometimes need to make it about ourselves. When actually it was teaching me discernment. Like, you know what, Melissa? Like I said, watch your internal dialogue. How I was treating myself was not very kind. B, not everybody needs to have access to you. And
Yep.
it's okay to create
Yep.
some boundaries. So sometimes our shadow work isn't necessarily to say, hey, you have this specific quality in you and it looks this way and it's operating this way. Sometimes our shadow work is, I'm not going to put up with that anymore. And here's what that looks like. And here's what I'm willing to do to protect my peace, my energy, what have you. So one of the things I love about the shadow, and this is so like it's so obnoxious when this happens to us, but it will defend us. It'll sometimes operate on our behalf if we haven't yet learned how to stand on our power. If you have a situation where you just want to say something so bad but you bite your tongue, and then
Mhm.
one day you're fed up and it comes out, and even though you're like, oh my gosh, that was so rude, but it was necessary.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like those moments, that shadow operating on your behalf to say the thing that was needed, but you just didn't have your humanity, like all the limiting beliefs we have and the complexes and all the other stuff. Maybe we didn't feel safe to do that. Maybe we didn't have the courage to speak that way. Maybe we felt like, oh my gosh, that's too intense for me. That's not normally how I present things. The shadow doesn't care about any of that. It's like, bam, in your face.
Mm.
Here it is. So sometimes that's necessary. And that's what's difficult, I think, when we talk about like the spiritual communities and personal development. Sometimes what they kind of like chime in with is, well, that's low vibration, and anger and rage can be sacred. Anger
Yeah.
and rage are human
Yeah.
experiences. And just because we tell someone off, hold our ground, cut out a toxic relationship, that is not low vibrational. That's discernment. That's self care. That
Yeah.
is an act of no longer abandoning the self. So it's
Yes.
necessary.
Yes. Yes. So much yes there. What about the shadow piece in, how we project things onto other people? So somebody comes into a room and I'm like, wow, they're so smart and they're so beautiful and they're so poised and they're so this. And I almost sometimes think if we can see it in someone else, then it is within us.
Yes. I think that too. I do think that too. I think there's layers of that because it's calling our attention to it. I think that quality can be underdeveloped or in shadow. The other thing it could also be is sometimes there's an edge to it. Like, for example,
Yeah. Like if there's a jealousy edge.
yeah, like if somebody walks in the room, like, I'm sorry, but no matter how good I am at controlling my mind and my thoughts, I'm never going to be 5'8". Like, unless I do that with my shoes or something, right? So
Yeah.
it's not always the strict same kind of answer actually before with the other situation where sometimes the shadow acts on your behalf or it comes out or it will the qualities will be mirrored but in a creative different way. I think it's the same thing for the positive qualities. Sometimes for sure I think those are things we're drawn to develop in ourselves, and other times I think there's an opportunity to see what is it bringing up Is there a charge around it? If I'm insecure about my height, just using that example,
Yeah.
and I see somebody else walk into the room that's taller, if there's an emotional reaction to that, then there's a charge. That means there's something there to work with. But not
Mm.
always the case, right? If we've kind of made peace with something, or if we just don't have a complex that's operating within the psyche that's driving our
Yeah.
unconscious behaviors, we're not even going to notice their height. We might just be like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, they have such a fabulous smile. They're such a great person. Might not even have calculated the height because there wasn't a filter within us that was conditioned to look for certain details based on
Yeah.
what we need to individuate.
Yeah. So there's that charge.
Yeah.
I mean, my saying for 2024, and I think it's just going to be ongoing, is that our greatest growth goes from stepping into those places of being uncomfortable. And we're so good at avoiding uncomfortable situations. And so it's having those uncomfortable conversations and sitting with our own discomfort. It is maybe doing things outside of our comfort zone, like you'd said, public speaking, like forcing ourselves to do things that are uncomfortable, because we'll never grow if we're just in that place of status quo and wanting to be comfortable and wanting everything to be safe.
Yes.
Um, and so what are your thoughts around that, or what is your advice around that?
I love this so much because I think sometimes, or at least I'll just speak for myself and say, sometimes I have this delusional thought that, like, if I'm ready for something, it'll feel better. It'll feel easier. It'll feel smoother. But the truth is, growth can be painful. So if we're learning how to step into those things, what helps me is to remember I can trust that my psyche is leading me through this. I can trust that there are parts of me that know better than my conscious mind, because my
Mm-hmm.
mind only know so much. I tell my clients, imagine that you have a flashlight and you're in this dark room and it's filled with all these things, but you can't see them. You can only see what the light will show you. So if you're pointing this flashlight, and if it's like a laser beam, right,
Yeah.
you're only going to see this one narrow little thing. But when you work on your ego, when you develop that ego strength, you lean into discomfort, you realize it's not going to kill you, it's not going to annihilate you the way the mind wants you to think. You'll survive it, you'll be okay. Often we step into something, we feel amazing, but we forget that over and over, because the ego's job is to keep us safe. That's one of its many roles, is to keep us safe. And so we have these perceived threats. If I speak up, it'll look like this. If I'm more authentic, I'm going to lose people. If I let in more money, I'm going to sabotage whatever. We have all these limiting beliefs. But when we work on the ego, it turns it from that flashlight into a dimmer switch.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is that dimmer switch, you start to look around and go, oh my gosh, there's like all this treasure at my feet here. There's like all this stuff going on in this space that I had no awareness of. I was so fixated on that one beam of what I could see. And if we can see it, that means it's already actualized. All these
Yeah.
other things we're talking about, we want to step
Yeah.
into, they're unfamiliar, they're not integrated. The unknown is really disorienting for us. And our tendency is to cling to the familiar, to go back. But sometimes life pushes us into this space where it's like, there is no back. I don't know what forward is, but I know I can't go back there. And that's
Yeah.
terrifying. So the ego will start to cling to things. It will hang on to people, situations, circumstances that we consciously know this isn't good for me, but we're scared or afraid. So if
Mm.
you're feeling discomfort, what I say is really find a trusting person. It can be a friend, it can be a loved one who's willing to hold the vision with you, and you share with them what your vision is. I want to speak more confidently. I want to grow my business. I want to, your goals, your ambitions. And I have like a sacred little pact I made with a friend of mine. And it was like, hey, if I'm being a brat, or if I'm just being like absurd, ridiculous, narcissistic, something, please let me know. But
Yep.
the other thing we do is also remind me of my magic, because I forget. And we do that with each other. And I'll tell you,
Yes.
it's
That's so
such a year of
important.
growth from having that relationship, that friendship. So create those kind of things where it's okay to dip into the negative. It's okay to default into self-doubt, or even some deeper, more painful experiences. It's temporary, and you need to have positive, healthy people that are willing to be like, you're just forgetting your magic right now, but it's still there. I promise you. Let's get back to that.
Yeah.
After you deal with being human first, feel the feelings, acknowledge them. Don't shut it out. Like you said earlier, don't escape, right? It's
Yeah.
not trying to escape. Be with it, but don't let it define you, and keep moving forward.
Yeah. I feel like that's the definition of a true healthy relationship, is somebody that can reflect your light back to you more often than not, and then also hold you accountability, but with compassion and love. And I think like we need to surround ourselves with people that bring brightness into our life and not dim our light out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And conflict is okay, you know, it's okay if we have some tension. It's okay if we have some oppositional energy, if we're having arguments, if we're getting into stuff. All of that is a part of growth too. So I just want to say also be careful that if you're having some of that go on, try to be open that this is leading to deeper, richer conversations, because sometimes we avoid the conflict, or we
Yeah.
associate it, project, and go, oh, that's a toxic thing because this is happening. It's like the pattern might be toxic, or the pattern might be a problem, but sometimes it's needed to create the tension. So the ego grows through tension. That's what actually
Yeah.
forces it to die and be reborn over and over again. This is why we will refer to it as an ego death. It actually breaks down and is recreated over and over. And its orientation changes. So when we're younger and we care more about like what we look like, what we own, the roles in the world that we have, it's oriented toward the outer world. But the more that we grow the ego, the more that we develop this ego strength and do this type of work, um, we care more about the authentic self than what the
Yeah.
outer world has to say. But
Yeah.
sometimes there's conflict there that's necessary. So don't think you're doing something wrong. It's actually probably exactly where you need to be, but there
Yeah.
might be healthier ways to confront it and work through it.
Well, and in spiritual communities, there's this whole thought about like ego's bad and we need to get rid
Right.
of the ego. But ego is, we can have a healthy ego. We can't be functioning on this planet without ego.
That's right. In fact, if you didn't have an ego, you would be in danger of a lot of other things. You would be more at the whim, let's say, of the unconscious and deeper impulses and behaviors and survival mechanisms that are a bit more harsh, more barbaric.
Yeah.
And so a healthy ego is really good. And a healthy ego means that there's boundaries. So a healthy ego understands I need to have a sense of self that's
Yeah.
independent from the world and from others. And it's actually healthier for yourself and the client if you can hold your energy differently and have that healthy ego. Because also a good counselor, therapist, coach, you're gonna get some pushback every now and then, right? You're gonna have
Yeah.
something come back at you when you bump up against somebody's blind spot or their energetic charge, their shadow. You need to be able to hold that. And a fragile ego will usually collapse or crumble in the presence of those things. They'll actually start to shut down. They make it personal. What did I do? What did I say? Oh my gosh, this person hates me. They're never going to talk to me again. Like
Yeah.
we all go through these phases, but a fragile ego is actually quite dangerous for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. That makes sense. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Melissa, thank you. I love this conversation so, so, so much. I feel like you and I could sit in a box and talk for hours and we would never get bored.
I totally agree. I love this so much.
Can you just share how people can connect with you, what some of your offerings are, and things like that?
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I love these conversations. They're so helpful. Even just us talking back and forth, I feel like people really get a sense and they have things coming up and being reflected. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Hmm.
The best thing you can do is honestly just go to my website. It's melissacorter.com. I have pretty much everything on there. So I've got different courses and classes and workshops. My podcast is called A Dose of Depth with Melissa Kim Corter. I go into the symbolic forms found in film, forensics, and fairy tales. I actually have a little bit of a darkness meter on there, like little
That's
skulls, so
smart.
people can be like, all right, she's going to go really deep and dark in this one, maybe not so much this one. So I tried to use that for people that might be sensitive to that type of content. And then I have a Substack blog called Hauntingly Beautiful Things. And it's where I
Mm,
really celebrate the darker, more misunderstood parts of the personality and show how there's beauty found in that. And
mm.
I have a book coming out. It's going to be a while. It's not until late in 2025, but I'm really excited about it. It's all about shadow work and using fairy tales. So this whole conversation, pretty much a lot
Yeah.
of that is going to be in the book. Yeah, so that'll be out in like 10 months or so or something like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Melissa. I loved every minute of this chat with you.
Me too, Nikki. This is so great. And thank you for what you do. This is like giving people a platform to share and connect like this is, oh my gosh, it's so needed in this world. Like we really
Mm,
need these things in this world. It's amazing. And I just
mm.
love being able to have conversations with like-minded people and go really deep with people and show that it can be fun and healing and it doesn't have to be so scary.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to the Connected Community Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I can be found at www.nickyyoga.com, NICKYYYOGA.com. Until I see you again next week, I hope you have a beautiful day.